now started recording this session. Just let us know if you feel uncomfortable with that. So we don't put that online, but there's nothing really confidential. But just let us know, because then everybody can watch this presentation today online. So welcome again. So welcome at this second monthly talk the EVICT project. That the EVICT project is organizing. So the EVICT project is a project that deals with the international right to housing and whether that actually helps preventing people from being evicted. So we have a monthly talk that deals with housing law, and we just ask prominent speakers from the field to tell something about their research related to the right to housing or housing law in general. So my name is Michel Vols. I'm the project leader of the ERC EVICT project. And now I will show you a short video. We're very proud of that, about the EVICT project, because we have a new website, but since a week we have a video as well. So that's the project. That's the EVICT project. I'm not going to tell some more about the EVICT project. You can just scroll the website eviction.eu. There's a lot of literature online, a lot of explanation about how we use the data science techniques and so on. But we also do a lot of doctrinal legal research, like the classical thing that lawyers love to do. And we also founded this international network on housing rights and evictions, where you can all join. It works together with the ENHR network. It works together with the 10 Law network. But it's just finding more people interested in housing law and housing rights, and just connecting people from all over the globe. So the talk series is a monthly talk by a prominent speaker, a prominent researcher. And this month I'm very happy that we have Dr. Irina Domurath present with us. She will talk about the relationship between EU law and housing markets, local housing markets, and how they relate to each other. I'm very happy. I've met Irina a few years ago in Amsterdam. She was a postdoc over there in Amsterdam, working with Professor Chantal Mack, also working on housing issues and also the right to housing. Now she's based in South America, in Chile. And it's autumn over there, she just told. So I hope her presentation will bring some sun to our Friday afternoons. So Irina, the floor is yours. I will switch to your presentation.
Yes, thank you, Michel, very much for your kind words and including me in this line of prominent scholars, as you said.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt. So what do you prefer? Do you prefer that people can just ask questions right away, or do you want to keep people keeping their questions for the end, so we will have some end?
I have no problem being interrupted. So if there's something urgent that's to interrupt me, I have no problem. But there's also a lot space for discussion. So I think I will talk about 20 minutes. So whatever you prefer, I have no preference.
Okay. So there's no sign that you can just wave to me that you want to ask a question. So just be Dutch and rude and just interrupt then, right? If you really want to interrupt something. Okay. Irina, again, sorry for interrupting.
As a German, I can handle it. So,
Okay, that's sorry again, Irina, for interrupting, but now the floor is yours.
no problem at all. Yeah, as you said, I'm in Chile at the moment. We also have a lot of housing problems here, but they're very similar to the European ones. And I'm at the moment implementing a project on universal services in Chile. So this is a bit connected, even though what I'm going to present today is the European part of this project, basically. And I wrote this 2 years ago. But I'm very happy to pick up the discussion because some things have happened in the field in the last year, especially. And I'm very happy that Porrick is here. We can discuss the more recent developments as well, and also maybe have some more look into what is happening in different member states, because there's also supposed to be a talk about local housing needs. So I think there's a lot of room and need for discussion. So I'm very, very happy to be able to pick up this work that I wrote 2 years ago. Ever since I have, as you already mentioned, I also worked with Chantal. We have published a paper on the different character and the different impact of the right to housing in different housing sectors. So it matters whether housing is private or public, and the right to housing as well changes in these contexts. So I think this is also something that plays a role. I will not go into the details today, but it's always shining through all these discussions. So I'm very happy to connect all these in the discussions later, and as I said, respond to any questions also while I talk. So my talk today is about housing kind of encroached in between EU law and local law. So it's a talk about tensions and about a lot of wiggle room for regulation and needs and different approaches. So let's just dive into this. Click, please. Yeah, so the idea I had for this contribution to the yearbook of European law came because it's, as we all know, that we work in the field of housing, there's a lot of problems, especially in urban housing markets, to access housing that is affordable but also of a good quality. So here are some numbers from Berlin, late numbers from Berlin. The average that you would have to pay for a 55 square meter apartment, so fairly small, probably single people, not for families, and it starts at 500 euros, which is still okay, but still a lot for students and the people that could live in 50 square meters, and goes up to more than 20 euros per square meter in highly sought after areas. And I'm aware that Berlin, this is just an example, because Berlin in international comparison is still doing fairly well when we look at the absolute prices, but in comparison to income, these prices are already very complicated for Berliners. Sorry, was there a comment? No, yeah. So we have they're much more expensive cities in Europe, but Berlin is catching up, and there has been a lot of discussion and political discussion in Berlin as well on the local level. Click, please. But this is just to illustrate a bit the problem. What I want to claim today is that EU law, as it currently stands, does not give legal space to local concerns on housing markets and housing sectors. And I think it could help to think of not just social, but also private housing as a service of general economic interest, an SGEI. So what I want to do is I want to give a quick overview of the competences in the housing sectors, just to identify a bit the tensions that there are and problems that there is for that there are for local authorities to voice their local needs, in the regulation of housing sectors. Then I will go to what are services of general economic interests and why housing, also private housing, should be considered one on EU level. And then open with some questions for discussion. Click, please. Again, so EU housing law is a very scattered field. Competences are cutting across different levels. So on EU level, we have, of course, the internal market, The EU deals with has the exclusive competence actually for competition on the internal market and shared competence for the internal market. We will see, and this is one of the problems in the housing field, that this is a very broad competence that intrudes into all different levels. There is national law, especially welfare, social law. In the field of housing, what matters is that rental law, rental codes are national law. And with regard to evictions, for example, procedural law is also very important and in the hands of member states. But there's also a regional dimension to housing, especially in administration. We have zoning laws and building and construction licenses on local level, administered by local authorities. There are also some member states that have local rental law. I understand that in Spain, the regional authorities have competence to enact rental regulations. Berlin tried. I am from Berlin, that's why it's my go-to example. Berlin tried and to put, so there was a national change of rental law to dampen a bit the calculation of rents, but Berlin, on top of this, put a cap on rents. And the Constitutional Court just last month, I think, ruled that this was unconstitutional for competence reasons. So there's also a tension, not just between EU law, national law, but also national law and regional law. Interestingly, the Constitutional Court did not say anything, of course, on the constitutionality of such a cap in general, but took refuge to the formal aspects, which was not surprising, but still a big setback for the initiatives that there are in Berlin. So that's why rental law is a bit in brackets when it comes to regional law. Click, please. So the political idea in the EU is that it sounds very good. We have a multi-level governance in the EU, a system of polycentricity where all actors on different levels matter. The European Economic and Social Committee attributed an essential role to regional and local authorities and acknowledge their discretion in the organization of housing sectors according to the local needs at hand. Because obviously we all know that in housing that local needs can vary within states to a tremendous degree. Urban areas often highly sought after and have affordability problems, and rural areas there are a lot of vacancies. So there are different needs. The EU urban agenda focuses on facilitating access to EU funding for urban authorities and the creation of a base of urban policy knowledge. So it's all about urban actors matter, the local authorities matter. However, this is just, as I want to claim today, just a political idea that is not legally visible. And even if we already read a bit the policy documents, we can get a glimpse of what I mean. Click, please, Michelle, because when we read the urban agenda, for example, it states that in order to realize the full potential of the European Union and deliver on its strategic objectives, the EU strives to involve urban authorities in achieving better regulation, better funding, and better knowledge. So it's all about delivering the strategic objectives of the EU. So local objectives don't actually matter, only as long as they run counter to what the EU wants. And we can see this in a lot of commentary. Click, please, because the legal reality, we will see this in the housing case just in a moment, is one of constitutional asymmetry. So it's the reverse pyramid. It's not even that EU law is a very tiny field on top of national and local law. It's that EU law intrudes massively into national and local law. And this is a reality that we can see, click please, also in housing cases. So the most prominent one was the Libert case. I think it was decided in 2013, which was about a Flemish decree in the Netherlands. And Libert and others complained against this Flemish decree on land and real estate property on mainly, I would say, two reasons. So the decree in order to foresaw that in order to authorize land development and building projects, the project depended on a sufficient connection with the commune. And this sufficient connection was supposed to be established through a 6 years continuous residence or a professional social economic similar reason of similar importance of significance. The goal of that decree was to combat gentrification. And the second part of the complaint was targeted a social obligation that the decree imposed on developers to ensure the supply of social housing units. Click, please. What the Court of Justice did was to deem the whole decree disproportionate, a disproportionate restriction of all four market freedoms, basically all at once. Because with regard to the social housing obligation, for example, it also restricted the free movement of EU nationals that had actually enough financial means to move to the region, so they didn't have an access problem. Click, please, and actually 3 times click. It applied, thank you, it applied an alternative means test. It means that it looked into whether the local authorities would have had other less restrictive means at their disposal to reach the same goal of providing social housing and combating gentrification, and said that there was, because, for example, the local authorities could have got given purchase subsidies to the less affluent parts of the population. What is interesting is that it didn't really matter that this was a decree that only concerned a relatively small region and a very small territory in EU comparison. Also, the court deemed that all four market freedoms were restricted at once. So there was no detailed analysis of how the restrictions violated each freedom of movement. It focused on freedom of capital, and with the violation of freedom of capital, also saw all the other free market freedoms as violated. And so in the end, there was no de minimis rule that could have been applied, and it's never applied when it comes to restricting internal market rules. And there was a very high burden of proof. And this is what we meant with constitutional asymmetry. So the internal market is kind of the sounding board, is the main rule, and everything else has to be justified. It's not the other way around. It could be the other way around, that when the EU wants to act, it has to show that it does not disproportionately restrict what local housing or national authorities want to do. So this is what is the constitutional asymmetry, and this is a very strong asymmetry and very visible when we look into hardcore EU law. So there is a tension between the political commitment to local housing needs and what the EU actually does. Next, please. So I think that this has something to do with services of general economic interest. Not just because the tensions in the field of services of general economic interest are similar, but also because I think housing is prone to be considered such a service. Click, please. These services rank very prominently on the EU agenda and in the treaties. So Article 14 states that the Union and the member states, each within their respective powers, shall take care that such services of general economic interest operate on the basis of principles and conditions, particularly economic and financial conditions, which enable them to fulfill their missions. Click, please. And the Charter of Fundamental Rights in Article 36 guarantees access to services of general economic interest. Click, please. The interesting thing about these SGEI is that they're exempt from certain very important internal market rules. So, for example, from the prohibition of special rights, Article 106, paragraph 2 on the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union says that undertakings that are entrusted with the operation of SGEI shall be exempt from this provision of special rights insofar, the other way around, that the article, the prohibition of special rights, applies to these undertakings unless the application of these rules obstructs the performance and law and effect of that particular task. And next, please. The SGEI also are exempt from state aid rules to a certain extent from Article 107, because the Commission enacted a de minimis regulation that I think was also extended now, at least until the end of 2022, that states in its preamble that in the light of the Commission experience, aid granted to undertakings providing an SGEI should be deemed not to affect trade between member states and not to distort or threaten competition, provided that the total amount of the aid does not go over €500,000. So these are very important exemption from internal market rules that gives the nation states, the member states, a certain leeway to maintain monopolies on the markets, and it's interesting exemptions for housing as well, as I will argue. Click, please. So what are the services of general economic interest? They are part of what can be called public services. These public services consist of services of general interest that lie within member state competence. These are usually social services, welfare services. Health is a bit in gray here because the Commission has expressed interest in taking health out of the social realm and treating it as an economic service. But as so far, it still is part of the SGEI framework for which the member states retain competence. And the important thing in here is that these services are governed by some kind of solidarity rationale that can lead to redistribution among the population. In contrast, services of general economic interest are, as the name says, of an economic nature. The EU has expressed a lot of interest in these services since the 90s, since the privatization of the utilities sector, energy, water, transport, postal services, broadcasting, and telecommunications. So there has been a push towards privatization, and the EU has used this opportunity to build these markets also within the EU. And in contrast to SGEI, these SGEI are provided on a market basis. Next, please. The definition, what both have in common, the service of general interest and services of general economic interest, is that they're governed by public service obligations and universal service obligations, which together basically mean that citizens have to have, or the undertakings that provide these services have to grant access in line with the Charter to these services. And this also includes very often affordability requirements, because if these services are not affordable, of course, we don't have access to them either, de facto. Next, please. So what is an SGEI concretely is left to the member states. So in the EU legal order, member states are free to determine what they want to see and treat as an SGEI in their territories. And with this, they deem to carve out some regulatory national space to exempt certain sectors from the application of internal market rules. This, of course, clashes with the EU competence and the surveillance, the keen surveillance of the Commission over the implementation of internal market rules and their application. And what is actually happening is that the Commission is also reviewing the definitions of member states. So it's encroaching more and more also on this freedom of the member states to define even what is an SGEI. There was a case in the Netherlands, I think also in Ireland, maybe Pora can comment on this, but in the Netherlands there was a case where the part of the definition was that people have difficulties to find suitable housing. And this for the Commission was not concrete enough. And they were supposed to focus more on specific target groups. Next, please. So in the, next please, Michelle. In the definition of what is an SGEI on housing, in housing markets, for example, next please, member states do deem social housing part of SGEI. And they have different definitions, but they use similar criteria as affordability, a non-market method of allocation, non-profit base of provision, and the focus on target groups. However, the Commission, as I just mentioned in the Dutch case, focuses quite narrowly on target groups, and this leads to member states having to revise their definitions. So this is a problem, and this reflects the constitutional asymmetry and this reflects the tensions that there are between different levels of competence, and it reflects the encroaching character of EU law in different levels of governance. Be that as it may, law is never easy, and the governance of social housing, of housing sectors is not easy either. So I would like to argue that not only social housing should be considered a service of general interest, but also private housing. Next, please. Basically for the following 4 reasons. So I think both social and private housing have a public function. This public function, as Cohen and McDermott said already some years ago, is merely obscured on private markets because of the entrance of private actors. But that doesn't mean that housing in itself has a public function. And this is a bit different from the social function of providing a shelter. This also has to do with the ability of citizens to become autonomous, responsible citizens and exercise political rights. We need space to be autonomous and to be private and build ourselves as citizens. And this is what housing is for. There's also a parallel to be drawn in two ways with the utilities sector. So first of all these sectors, the utilities and housing, have been subject to privatization in the last decades to more or less extent in different member states, because it depends on how strong welfare states are and how much they intervened in the housing sectors to begin with and how big social housing sectors were or are. But there is, however, a converging trend towards more privatization or the private governance of social or public housing initiatives. So there is a trend towards privatization that is very comparable to what happened to the utilities, especially in the 90s. There's also a conceptual dimension to this parallel, because housing and utilities go together. Utilities like water and energy are useless if you don't have a house to benefit from them, and the other way around. If you just have a roof over your head without access to water and energy, it's not worth that much. It may provide shelter from rain, but that's it. So there's a conceptual parallel. They go hand in hand, and I think that's why there's also a good case to be made for private housing to be considered a similar SGEI as these utilities. I also think that if we see private housing as an SGEI, we would acknowledge a reality of the EU already expressing interest in these, and the EU should have an interest in treating private housing as an SGEI, because it could help, and this is a discussion that we can maybe lead later, or maybe engage in later. It could help the EU to build a social market economy. But also from an economist perspective, which is very often what the EU institutions take when considering engagement and regulation of markets, the argument is that there is a huge market failure here. Homelessness is rising, but also vacancies are rising. So this is the prime definition of a market failure that could merit some intervention. And also in that sense, the European Economic and Social Committee has said that intervention in private housing markets is actually needed and warranted. Well, and the last reason to treat private housing in conjunction with social housing as an SGEI is that I think it could give space to the legal articulation of local housing needs beyond the political commitment that there is. And this is because local housing needs could benefit from the exemption from internal market rules. Next slide, please. So in cases concerning Article 106, concerning special rights on the Treaty on the Function of the European Union, the Court of Justice often employs a manifest error test. So it basically means that the court only analyzes whether the authorities, be it national or local, have made a manifest error in the allocation of these special rights. And if you remember, in the Libert case, the test was rather one of whether alternative means were available that would restrict internal market rules to a lesser degree. So the proportionality test would be weaker, and it would be easier for member states, because the burden of proof would be lower, to get this exemption from internal market rules granted. And also what local authorities could benefit from is the application of the de minimis regulation, because especially on local level, if financial aid is granted, this would not always, amount to more than €500,000. So there is space that would exempt local housing sectors in certain cases from the application of internal market rules. So this would be beneficial, and maybe the Libert case would have been decided differently if housing, both social and private, would be considered an SGEI. Next, please. So let's discuss a few points more in detail. maybe, and I would put forward three points for discussion. One problem that, of course, I see with the application of treating housing as an SGEI is that this would emphasize the economic function of housing, right? Because it's a social, general economic interest. And we can argue that ideologically, this is a problem if we see housing as a more social public good. Treating it as an economic service does make some noise. On the other hand, we could say, well, this is just the reality already, so we can as well just acknowledge it and in that way create some legal space for national and also local concerns. Then we could discuss whether it actually helps truly to build a social market economy. If we think about utilities, we have had utilities treated at SGEI since, well, for 30 years now almost. And still a truly social model in the EU has not emerged. Probably this would only be possible through a certain dissociation from the privatization logic and a joint responsibility of the EU and the member states to really take care of the so-called vulnerable consumers. On the other hand, there is an inherent social function of housing that maybe won't be lost after all. I think this is something that we can discuss. And another discussion that is very prominent in the field of SGEI is the character of citizenship rights. So there are a lot of commentators that say that public service obligation and the universal service obligation are linked to citizenship, and the fact that consumers in that field are treated as more vulnerable than in the other fields of internal market law shows that there is a social citizenship concern enshrined in these obligations. However, there are other authors that say, well, that's all fine, but still we have to see that by expanding the realm of SGEI, we also change our perception of what citizenship is. So there is a conflation in the EU between purchasing rights and political rights and consumer choice and political choice. And the direct relation between the state and the citizen is marginalized because states create regulatory agencies that step in and then are not politically accountable, but only financially accountable. So this changes our perception of what citizen rights are and should be. And some commentators like Sauter, for example, says that it's too early to call public services as part of citizen rights precisely for this reason. So I think there are a lot of problems involved in this. It also depends a lot on national and local experiences, and I'm very happy to discuss any of this with you further. I don't have all the answers. I just thought it would be fun to put forward this claim and discuss this with you. Next is the most important slide. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. Thanks. That was a wonderful presentation. I will stop sharing the screen and I will now open the floor for anyone who wants to ask a question. I'm pretty sure that there will be questions. Is there anyone? There's no sign or so, to just wave your hand or scream. Anyone with a question? Patrick, I see. I was already expecting you maybe to wave your hand. So that's great.
Me too.
Yes, thank you very much, Irina. That was a fantastic presentation. I agree with everything you said, even though we haven't met I think we haven't met for more than a year now, and you have a daughter in the meantime, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
I just done a report on this very topic for the Irish housing providers, and I had to present it with the Minister for Housing about 3 weeks ago. So it was attended by a lot of journalists. Housing is a very political issue here. So we had a lot of questions. And the biggest thing that really shocked the whole lot of them was that housing providers are regarded as economic operators in European Union law. And so these social housing providers were going, but we're not economic operators. We're nice, charitable people. You know, we just provide housing and we're nice to people. And we said, well, yeah, okay, but you're actually regarded by the European Commission as economic operators competing in a market with all these other economic operators. And so you have to justify what you're doing according to having a public interest mission, public service obligation, and any funding you receive as state aid has to be justified in those terms. And so there was a major kind of, I suppose, sense of shock, really. But then some of the people from the government departments came to me afterwards and said, this was exactly what we've been trying to tell them for 20 years. But, you know, they don't believe us. And so it brings me back to that question. If they're economic operators in the market, does that mean they're competitors with the private landlords? And the answer is, of course, yes. Yes, it's the same people. And this is why the Dutch case, it's a few years now, turned on this question of what is the target group? Can you identify the target group who have a particular need? Because only if you can do that can we justify this state aid. And the Dutch case was really revolved around the question of the target group wasn't sufficiently precise. So what we did in Ireland is we looked at the income deciles of the population and we compared it with rents and said, here's a group who cannot compete in the private rented sector. They need state aid. So I think, yes, there's lots of questions around citizenship. We as human rights and housing people, I don't think we've reached that level of discussion where you're at the moment, Irina. I think there's a lot of people who haven't come to terms with this question yet of how the European Union sees housing providers as economic operators. So I'm going to stop there.
Thanks. Any response, Irina?
No, this is very to the point of what I was trying to convey. So there is a lot of tensions in housing sectors in general. So and it has to do with housing, right, at the moment at least, in this political economy, having both social and economic function. So it's not totally foreign to say that housing also has an economic function, because it is a fact that for many it is an investment outlet, be it for old age, or be it, you know, on a more corporate scale, to just make profit. And it is a reality whether we like it or not. I mean, of course I don't, because it does lead to a neglect of the social function that for most people it is just a roof over the head and a space to be private. But this is inherent in housing and has always been, at least in the last, I don't know, since the Second World War, I guess, maybe even before. I really don't know. So what the tensions in the law are reflecting is just this tension in itself in housing, right? And then if you allocate competences to different rounds, to social rounds and economic rounds, to different actors, then you have a lot of tensions and a lot of different perceptions of what housing should be or is. And the field of SGEI fits into this very well, because also the utility sector, for example, all these utility services have a social component, or a public component, as in broadcasting, for example, or a social component when it comes to access to water or energy. So that's why I also think this parallel between housing and SGEI is very warranted, because they're very similar in that sense, with the inherent tensions that there is in the sectors. And I think we have the Irish example is probably very, very prominent, because there were a lot of problems on Irish in Ireland also because of around the financial crisis, and there still are. But it's still a very good example to some extent to what is happening in all other member states as well. So I don't really know how to resolve this. I just think that the concept of SGEI, because it incorporates this tension, could help us to conceptualize better and maybe make the governance of housing a bit better in a bit more colloquial way to say, because it gives the space to operate with all these tensions. That's all I think is worth thinking about. And so far, social housing is considered an SGEI, but private housing is still out of this realm. So I think it's something to think about.
Thanks so much. Any other questions? Jane, floor is yours. Jane Ball. You're still muted, so we don't hear you.
That's it. Hello. First of all, that was a really interesting presentation. I had a look at the services of general economic interest some years ago, and in those days there's a directive on services of general economic interest, which followed cases where the Commission sued France, the Netherlands, Sweden, because they were providing worsening conditions for private landlords. And at that time, you had to provide, it was only counted as a service of economic interest if the tenants were below the poverty threshold, which is about 6% of the population. And of course, there are other housing needs. So, I mean, I was wondering if that had changed. What you're saying, it sounds like it has.
No, it has not changed, but there is a renewed interest of the Commission in housing, and they are encroaching more and more on this on what is being defined as an SGEI in the housing sector. So the other cases concerned more under which criteria stated could be exempted from internal market rules, and they did not always pronounce themselves on whether it's an SGEI or not, as far as I remember. So what has changed is that now it's about very specific target groups. If you say it's below the poverty line, now probably the Commission would say, I'm guessing, that this is not concrete enough, maybe. So they want very specific, maybe Porrick can comment on as well. This is very, it goes to the heart of member state competence of definition, and not just of claiming an exemption to internal market rules. So conceptually, it's a bit different, I guess. And so the quality changes of the EU interest in housing.
Thanks very much for that. That's interesting. I mean, this competition has got really very silly in Britain, because I don't know if you know, we had a scandal where there was a tower of flats which had combustible cladding.
Yes.
In order to get a grant from the government, individual tenants had to sign a form saying that their aid did not interfere with competition in the European Union. You know, these are social tenants. It was just ridiculous.
Yes, it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
Interesting.
But I don't know how high was this aid? How much was that?
It's billions, but it's not getting paid out, and there's terrible squabbles over who's responsible, because basically we have a very old tenure which predates 1066, which isn't found anywhere. It's found in Ireland, I think. But you get 999-year leases, you see, where traditionally the tenant pays next to nothing per annum. But there are a lot of shady operators, and international investors have piled in to displace the security, not fund repairs, and the government is bringing forward major legislation to basically destroy the old lease.
And so the Glenville Tower issue is not resolved yet. It's been years.
Nope. Well, I mean, to some extent, it's not the Grenfell Tower that's the problem. The problem is housing them elsewhere, because the tower's gone essentially. But there are lots and lots of blocks of flats which have combustible cladding, which is a scandal in the cladding industry, because they got combustible plastic in them, and people are having to pay watchmen to walk around the flats at night in case it catches fire. It is,
it's actually interesting to see what happens now with Brexit, because to what extent Britain will still be aligned with internal market rules or not. So actually it will be interesting to see what happens there.
I think we have to do that to trade at all, to be honest. But this is a particularly unattractive corner. Yes.
I don't know what the progress is in that regard, but it would be interesting to see. Probably we will see in a couple of years' time only.
We can have another talk, right? So with someone from the UK, right? So, but Patrick, you wanted to
present.
No, I think that's a very good point that Jean has raised there. The general view was that, you can provide housing for people who are poor, and it's not going to compete with the market. The problem is these days, people who are not poor can pay for rents, so you're now having a new question about how much can you justify state aid to provide for 60% of the population, because 60% of them cannot afford market rents. And so this is where the line of, if you like, battle lines have formed in a way. The Dutch decision covered about 40% of the population. But even nowadays, we did some studies here. We found 70% of people cannot afford to rent in the rented sector without a subsidy. And so the question is, can you justify a subsidy and call it state aid for these people who are earning pretty high salaries? People would say, these people are not poor, but yet we have to provide subsidized housing for them. So this is the question, how far do you justify market interventions on the grounds of public policy? Because these market interventions now are going to have to be very substantial.
This is a very good point, Bart, thank you. Because true that especially in the Netherlands, people in general are not poor there. There are very few officially called poor people. And in Amsterdam, I lived there, so anecdotal evidence now, it's really crazy. I had so many problems finding a place to stay, and my salary was fine. I mean, I was far from being considered poor. So that's why also the definition of the Dutch authorities was very broad, was about who cannot find suitable housing. And maybe this should be the definition, because it would be much more in line with what people need, but it's not. So the Commission definition is much more technical in that sense, based on economic parameters that are very low, probably. I mean, the poverty threshold is low. So it's a very good point, and this is why the definition of what is an SGEI is so important, and that's why it's also so important that the Commission thinks that it should intervene in what this is, because it's in the end about exempting from the application of internal market rules. So yeah, it's a very important point. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So there are 3 people raising there is an option to raise your hand, actually, so that's good. So we just collect the 3 questions of Koert and Nuria and Martin, and that you then respond. Everybody can pose this question. So first I would like to give the floor to Koert. I'm not sure whether he's still there. Koert, do you hear us?
Thank you very much for the presentation. Yes, can you hear me?
There are some connection
Very
issues.
badly.
It's bad. So maybe we can first go to Nuria, and then your connection will be better, and then come back to you, Koert. Is that okay? I'm just deciding. So Nuria, floor is yours.
Thank you. Sorry, Koert. Sorry. Well, I was just wanted to, first of all, thank you very much for the presentation. It was truly interesting. And I was just linking with what Padraig said. I see these contradictions nowadays from the European Commission decision in terms of the Dutch case, and then, but nowadays we have all the international organizations, and also the European Parliament is against restricting and targeting the scope so much, and is fostering affordable housing instead of social housing. So that's, I don't know, what's your opinion about, like, on the one side we have European Commission saying we have like states have to narrow the target, and on the other side new policies and the new political field or housing policies field is let's go and finance and fund affordable housing. So it's kind of contradictory. I don't know what's your opinion, or how do you see it?
Yes, it is a contradiction, and it will all, I think, boil down to, again, to definitions. So to what extent, because if it's about affordability, it again goes a bit in the direction of the Dutch case, right? So whatever is affordable for different parts of the population is not very concrete, and it probably won't be concrete enough for the Commission, I'm guessing. So I think there is a lot of trouble coming up in that sense. So, and I think that's why it's also timely to talk about this, and that's why I was so happy to retake this article that I wrote, because a lot has happened, especially in the last year, and will happen. And I think it's going to be problematic, and probably the member states will have to revise and be in a lot of dialogue with the Commission to make it fit different criteria.
Thanks. I continue with, let's try Kurt again, right? So your connection is now maybe better.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay, so thank you, Irina, for the presentation, and of course, Mitchell, for organizing a series of talks. I have three brief comments to make relation to the discussion that has been going on after.
It's actually very bad. I don't hear. I don't hear you very well. Sorry.
Kurt, your connection is very bad, so maybe you can ask your question in the chat, so we can then read it, and then Irina can answer it. That may work better.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Do that.
Okay, great, thanks. Then I will give the floor now to Martin, so he can ask his question, and then later on we can look in the chat. Sorry for that, Kurt. Martin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Irina, for a very nice introduction. I haven't met any of you before. I'm Martin Granda. I'm from Malmö University in Sweden, and I've been invited here by my friend Ola Ingrid. I'm a housing researcher, very interested in the public and the social housing sector. I've been writing quite a lot about that the last 10 years. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Swedish case, which is highly relevant in this discussion, because it relates to the Dutch case and also the general discussion here, because the state of public housing in Sweden right now, and has been since 2011, is that we have no subsidized actors at all on the rental market, which is then due to the SGEI criterions. And when the Swedish government decided on this back in 2011, they decided that we didn't want to have a specific bottom floor for specific actors on the rental market. So what we decided was that we should have no subsidized housing actors at all, but instead that the public housing sector should compete on exactly the same terms as private rental operators, which means that we are in a situation right now where we have a quite drastic increase in this middle group of tenants who have low to middle low income and which are not eligible for help from the social services. And I think this is a very interesting discussion, because we see the same problems as we do in all other European countries and larger cities, but we don't have any social housing sector at all for those people. So we have no rental housing decided earmarked for those people, which is subsidized by municipalities or the state. So I think we are right now in the discussion of how to revive the discussion on SGEI in Sweden, and how we should perhaps find new definitions in the rental sector in order to actually find a solution for those people who are not at the absolute bottom, but in the low and middle low income segments. I don't know if you have any specific comments on that, but I'd love to discuss this further with you the future, perhaps.
Thanks. Irina, any response, comments?
Yes, so actually I have a counter question to Martin, because what happened in Berlin is that we had a lot of social housing stock, like because of the reunification, we had a lot of public housing, was all in public hand. Then in the 90s, this got all sold off to private, not all, but to private investors. The idea was to sell to the ones that were living in the apartments and in the houses, but this was not what happened in the end. So a lot of the flats, apartments, and houses and the land was sold to international investors. And what they're trying to do now is they want to buy back. So the city of Berlin wants to buy back that land, but of course at market prices now. So I don't know how this relates to what you said, but the problem of taking back public control is related to private property rights. It's not just a simple policy decision. So there are facts that the authorities now have to deal with. I don't know how this is in Sweden. I guess there was a similar, like the decision to not offer social public housing was also related to selling off lands, I guess.
Yeah, it is, and increased business demands also on municipalities and local governments and so on. And it's so interesting because I'm writing a paper on this phenomenon right now, because we see that Vonovia, the Dutch actor, is right now the biggest owner of rental apartments in Sweden, and they are actually buying the former public housing stock, which have been sold in different steps since the 80s and 90s, where the idea of new public management and business-like principles were attaching, gaining ground in all over Sweden. And what we're seeing is now that they are renovating the stock up in order to increase the standard and then do rent increases as well. So this is also part of a longer process of financialization, but also a juridification of a political issue, I see, which is actually leading to a severe shortage of affordable housing. And this is then connected to the European politics, I would say. So I think we are a bit behind the Berlin development, but we are seeing demands on buying this property back, because we have seen a decrease in the public housing sector from 25% to 16% of the total stock.
In Berlin, there are also initiatives, I don't know if you heard about it, to expropriate these large housing corporations based on a very rarely used, hardly ever used provision in the Constitution. So they are still collecting signatures, I think. And this is also, I mean, it's a very intrusive way, very intrusive on the market, but it's actually complicated in terms of in times of, you know, shrinking public budgets to buy back all this land. So, and Sweden is expensive too.
Yeah, it is absolutely. Well, okay, thank you. I won't take more of your time, but very interesting to hear about this, and I look forward to follow this.
Thank you so much. Gang of people. Feel free to just contact everybody that's here, right? So people are very engaged in just, or very open for discussion, and send an email, or send me an email if you want to have someone's contact details. That's no problem. Then Koert has a question in the chat, so I suggest that we will answer that question and then wrap this discussion up. Maybe Rachel did also something, right? Okay, then we have a question of Rachel, and then we will wrap this session up, and then we have a Friday afternoon drink in the Netherlands at least, right? So, Irina, did you already read Koert's question?
I'm reading. Wait, I'm not sure I understand. I'm sorry. Do you maybe, Michelle?
It's a long question, so in a chat, sorry for that, Koert. So is it maybe okay that Irina responds to that on email? Is that okay with you? I expect you to say yes.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yes.
So we will come back to you. Maybe other people. Patrick, do you see? I see you nodding.
Yeah. I think the biggest surprise, you know, a lot of people still believe that Sweden has the biggest social housing rented sector in Europe. I know it's not true, but actually I hear people in conferences all the time saying we should adopt the Swedish model. The general view is that Sweden overreacted to the Commission finding in that they went and privatized the whole stock. It was never really, that's not required to privatize the whole stock. But anyway, there we are. I think we also have to widen our view of what are the state tools for delivering housing rights, you know, and service of general economic interest just one. I mean, there's also the whole taxation possibilities. There's lots of other regulatory instruments that can be used. You know, services of general economic interest are about how much intervention and subsidies are allowed in the market, but there's lots of other tools. I mean, rent controls, you know, rent controls are a very effective tool. Everybody's watching the situation in Berlin because the Constitutional Court didn't say they were illegal. It just said that in terms of competences. So there's a bigger case coming along. And rent controls, of course, have been considered lots of times at the European Court of Human Rights, mostly for the Netherlands, have been found to be proportionate. So that's what I would say, you know, that yes, services of general economic interest are very important. Okay. Just my last point, there is a debate happening whether limited scarce resources should be allocated to those in the greatest need, where human rights arguments would apply, or whether they should be spread wider to those who are better off. And that's a political argument that's happening in lots of countries now.
Thanks.
Can I just respond, please? Just one more remark.
And just respond, and then we go to Rachel.
Yeah, no, it's just that it's very important what Porrick says, and the European Court of Human Rights, of course, is a very important actor as well. However, I just want to highlight that the yardstick of appreciation of the cases is totally different, right, for the two courts. So proportionality under the European Court of Human Rights has nothing to do with proportionality assessment in the EU law. So the Court of Justice is not interested in the proportionality as such of the measure. It's all about the effectiveness of EU law and the effectiveness of internal market rules. So whatever could be proportionate under the European Court of Human Rights jurisprudence does not have to be proportionate under Court of Justice of the EU case law. So there's a big problem here as well, and it's a conceptual problem, and this won't be solvable. But it's also highlights the difficult margin of maneuver of the member states here, because they're different yardsticks of appreciation. That's just what I wanted to say.
Thanks so much. Then we will. I will give the floor to Professor Alteman. Okay. You're still muted, so we don't hear you.
Hi, Irina. That was really fascinating. The topic is extremely important. And hello, several good friends and colleagues whom I see here. I'd like to follow, and that's Porrick and Jane and Kurt. We've collaborated in various ways, Kurt very recently. I'd like to follow up on what Porrick said about the image of Sweden. And what I wanted to say is that's the image of Central and Western Europe in the rest of the globe. And Central and people don't differentiate. They know East Europe is different. I'm not sure they differentiate between Southern Europe and Central and Western. The image is that you guys have this heaven and haven for excellent social housing. You have this mystique of the social obligation of property, and all this goes together into this wonder world. The tension between the protection of freedom of economic competition and housing is not exposed enough in the broader international literature. It is, to me, it's always, I get shocked again and again, even though I know Europe and I know EU law. Just this cat and mouse fight. I think it deserves a kind of higher conceptualization that Irina started with, a book, a special issue, just papers to expose this legally and policy-wise to the rest of the globe. It's hard to believe. It's hard to believe for outsiders that economic competition is put so much higher. Now, when we discuss housing law and the kind of danger or curtailment that EU freedom of competition legislation tackles. One should also say, in another area that I deal with, and I think several of you as well, is a topic of negotiations with developers, style planning gain or planning obligations and various other terms of the world. That too is challenged. So even the supply of social facilities is always somehow on the margin and has to compete with competition. All this deserves more attention and more elevation and more criticism that comes out of Europe beyond. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much. And I think that's a good way to end this seminar, this talk. And I hope this talk will inspire people to work together and maybe start a project on this topic, because I think it's interesting. We have that many member states in the European Union all struggling to deal with local housing issues and still need to comply with all the European Union rules. As Jane already mentioned, the UK is very interesting because they're now free, right? So let's see how they deal with it. Whether it will come better or not. I don't expect it will be better in the UK, but it doesn't. Let's see. For now, I would really like to thank Irina. It was a wonderful presentation. So thanks so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. So,
great.
Thank you so much. So I copied Koert's question, so I will send it to Irina by email, and then so maybe you can correspond with each other, right? So, and let's see what comes out of that. For the next talk, we asked Dr. Hector Simon from Spain, a colleague of Nuria, to talk about Spain. That will be June the 21st. We will spam you and send you all the emails again, right? And put it on LinkedIn. And the team of research assistants that is organizing it are doing a great job. So I still see some people also here. So we will have that Dr. Hector Simon on the 21st of June. Then we have a summer break, and then in September 17th, Patrick will give a talk. We still need to decide on what topic, but probably it will be about right to housing law, and so on. So we have two great speakers coming up, and then later on we will have more speakers that we will invite later. So thanks again. Enjoy your weekend, and see you hopefully next time. Bye.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Bye, everybody.
Yes,
Bye.